What if I told you that every relationship you've ever been in was actually a sophisticated psychological chess match, and you didn't even know you were playing? That beneath the surface of romantic connection lies an intricate web of unconscious power dynamics that have been shaping human behavior for millennia. Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who saw through the romantic illusions of his time, uncovered something profound about the nature of human relationships, particularly the subtle yet powerful ways that feminine psychology operates in the realm of love, attachment, and influence. But this isn't about gender warfare or pickup artist tactics. This is about understanding the deeper psychological forces that Jung called the unconscious and how they manifest in the most intimate areas of our lives. Today, we're diving into the hidden architecture of relational power, how it works, why it evolved, and what modern psychology reveals about these ancient dynamics. Because once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. And more importantly, you can finally start making conscious choices instead of being puppet by forces you don't understand. The story begins with a simple yet disturbing observation. Why do the most intelligent, accomplished men often find themselves completely bewildered by women who seem to effortlessly navigate relationships while they stumble through them? Why do patterns repeat across cultures and centuries, despite dramatic changes in society? And why does modern dating feel less like mutual discovery and more like an elaborate psychological game where the rules are never quite explained? Schopenhauer believed he had the answer, and what he discovered challenges everything we think we know about love, attraction, and the nature of human connection itself. The will behind the veil, Schopenhauer's revolutionary insight. In 1819, Arthur Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation, a work that would fundamentally reshape how we understand human motivation. But buried within this philosophical masterpiece was an insight that most scholars glossed over, one that modern evolutionary psychology is only now beginning to validate. Schopenhauer argued that beneath all human behavior lies what he called the will, a blind, unconscious force that drives every living thing towards survival and reproduction. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. It was a radical reimagining of human nature that stripped away romantic illusions to reveal the biological imperatives underneath. All love, Schopenhauer wrote, however ethereally it may bear itself, is rooted in the sexual impulse alone. But he wasn't being cynical, he was being precise. What we experience as romantic attraction, emotional connection, and even spiritual bond, he argued, are elaborate psychological constructions built on top of this deeper biological foundation. Here's where it gets fascinating. Schopenhauer observed that men and women, while driven by the same fundamental will, express it through completely different psychological strategies. And these strategies, refined over millions of years of evolution, create the complex power dynamics we see in modern relationships. Think about the last time you were deeply attracted to someone. Remember that feeling of being chosen, of being special, of finding your other half. Schopenhauer would have told you that what you were experiencing wasn't cosmic connection. It was your unconscious mind calculating genetic compatibility, social status, and reproductive potential. Your conscious mind simply created a beautiful story to make sense of these deeper impulses. But here's what makes this relevant to understanding feminine psychology. Schopenhauer noticed that women, constrained by the biological reality of pregnancy and child-rearing, had evolved far more sophisticated mechanisms for evaluating and influencing potential partners. They had to be. The stakes were simply higher. Nature has given women so much power that civilization has not been able to take it away, he observed. This power wasn't physical, it was psychological, and it operated through channels that most men didn't even recognize as forms of influence. The architecture of feminine influence. Let's be clear about what we're discussing here. This isn't about conscious manipulation or deliberate scheming. Most of the dynamics we're exploring operate below the threshold of awareness. They're as unconscious for women as they are invisible to men. They're part of what psychologists call evolved psychological mechanisms, mental programs that developed over evolutionary time to solve specific survival and reproductive challenges. Schopenhauer identified several key areas where feminine psychology demonstrates what we might call unconscious mastery. Emotional regulation and influence. Women, Schopenhauer observed, possess an intuitive understanding of emotional dynamics that allows them to navigate and shape the emotional landscape of relationships. This isn't manipulation. It's a sophisticated form of social intelligence that emerged from the evolutionary need to maintain relationships essential for survival. Consider this. When a woman says, "I'm fine," in a particular tone, most men immediately understand that something is wrong, even though the words themselves convey the opposite. This creates what Schopenhauer would call a double communication, surface content and deeper meaning transmitted simultaneously. The woman hasn't lied, but she has conveyed complex emotional information that requires the man to attune to her internal state. Strategic vulnerability. One of Schopenhauer's most controversial observations was that women had learned to leverage apparent weakness as a form of power. This sounds cynical until you consider it from an evolutionary perspective. In environments where physical strength determined survival, those who could influence others without direct confrontation possessed a crucial advantage. Modern psychology recognizes this as social intelligence, the ability to achieve goals through interpersonal influence rather than direct force. When a woman tears up during a conflict, is she being manipulative? Or is she unconsciously activating an evolved response pattern that signals distress and elicits protective behavior? The answer, according to Schopenhauer, is both and neither. She's following psychological programs that operate below conscious control. Indirect communication. Schopenhauer noted that women rarely communicate their deepest desires directly. Instead, they create situations where men choose to provide what they want. This pattern appears across cultures and historical periods, suggesting it's not learned behavior, but evolved psychology. For example, a woman might mention being cold rather than directly asking for a jacket. A man who provides the jacket feels like he's being chivalrous and attentive, while the woman gets what she needs without having to make explicit demands. Both parties feel good about the interaction, even though one person subtly guided the outcome. Testing and qualification. Perhaps Schopenhauer's most acute observation was that women unconsciously test men in ways that reveal character and capability. These tests aren't conscious schemes. They're evolved psychological mechanisms designed to gather information about a potential partner's suitability. When a woman cancels plans at the last minute, changes her mind repeatedly, or creates small challenges and obstacles, she might be unconsciously assessing how the man responds to uncertainty and stress. Does he become angry and controlling? Does he remain calm and flexible? Does he respect her autonomy or try to manipulate her back into compliance? From an evolutionary perspective, these behaviors make perfect sense. A woman's reproductive investment is enormous. 9 months of pregnancy, years of child-rearing, physical vulnerability during crucial periods. The psychological mechanisms that helped ancestral women evaluate potential partners would have been strongly selected for. The paradox of consciousness. Here's where Schopenhauer's insight becomes truly profound. These dynamics operate most effectively when they remain unconscious. The moment they become explicit, they lose much of their power. It's like explaining a joke. Understanding the mechanism often destroys the effect. This creates what we might call the consciousness paradox in modern relationships. As men become more aware of these dynamics, women must become more sophisticated in their approaches. As women become more conscious of their own psychological patterns, they might feel conflicted about behaviors that feel natural but now seem strategic. Schopenhauer predicted this tension. He argued that increasing consciousness would fundamentally change human relationships, but not necessarily make them better. Sometimes, he suggested, our illusions serve important psychological functions. Consider the modern dating dilemma. Apps and social media have made the strategic elements of mate selection more explicit than ever before. We can see the shopping behavior that previous generations kept private. We can observe the testing and qualification processes in real time. But has this transparency made relationships better or worse? Many people report feeling more cynical about love, more strategic in their approach to dating, more conscious of being evaluated and manipulating others. The romantic myths that Schopenhauer saw as illusions might have served important functions. They allowed people to experience genuine emotion, while unconscious psychological programs handled the practical business of mate selection. The will to power in relationships. Schopenhauer's concept of will connects directly to what Friedrich Nietzsche would later develop as the will to power, the fundamental drive to exert influence over one's environment. In relationships, this will to power manifests differently in men and women, creating complementary but often conflicting psychological strategies. Men, according to Schopenhauer's analysis, typically express will to power through direct action, achievement, resource acquisition, physical dominance, explicit competition. These are visible, measurable forms of power that can be consciously recognized and socially validated. Women, constrained by different evolutionary pressures, developed more subtle expressions of will to power, social influence, emotional regulation, indirect control of outcomes, and what Schopenhauer called the power of the seemingly powerless. These forms of influence are often invisible to those being influenced and can operate even in situations where women lack formal authority or resources. This difference in approach creates what Schopenhauer saw as the fundamental tension in heterosexual relationships. Men and women are playing different games by different rules, often without realizing it. Men compete in visible hierarchies while women navigate invisible networks of influence and alliance. Neither approach is superior. They're complementary strategies that evolve to solve different adaptive challenges. But in modern relationships, this complementarity often becomes antagonistic because we've lost the cultural frameworks that once made these differences explicit and manageable. The modern implications. Understanding these dynamics doesn't mean becoming cynical about love or viewing relationships as battlegrounds. Instead, it means developing what Schopenhauer called philosophical consciousness, the ability to see the deeper forces at work while still participating authentically in human connection. When you recognize that your partner's seemingly irrational behavior might be driven by evolved psychological mechanisms rather than personal flaws, you can respond with curiosity instead of frustration. When you understand that your own reactions are often driven by unconscious programs rather than conscious choice, you can create space for more intentional responses. Schopenhauer believed that consciousness was both a blessing and a curse. It allows us to transcend our programming, but it also makes us aware of forces we can't fully control. The challenge is learning to work with these forces rather than against them, to find ways of expressing our deepest nature while still choosing our responses consciously. This requires what modern psychology calls emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize and work skillfully with emotional dynamics rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. It means understanding that the same mechanisms that can create manipulation and conflict can also create depth, intimacy, and genuine connection when approached with awareness and goodwill. The goal isn't to eliminate these dynamics. They're part of what makes us human. The goal is to understand them well enough that we can choose how to engage with them. Because once you see the game, you can decide whether to play it, change it, or create something entirely new. And that's where the real power lies, not in unconsciously manipulating others or being unconsciously manipulated, but in the conscious creation of relationships that honor both our evolutionary heritage and our human capacity for choice, growth, and authentic connection. The patterns Schopenhauer identified aren't bugs in the human operating system. They're features that helped our species survive and thrive. The question for modern relationships is, how do we honor this inheritance while creating something even more beautiful and functional for the world we actually live in? The feminine unconscious, Jung's revelation about female psychology. Carl Jung, building on Schopenhauer's insights about the unconscious will, made a revolutionary discovery about feminine psychology that most of his contemporaries, and many modern psychologists, still struggle to fully comprehend. What Jung uncovered wasn't just theory. It was a detailed map of the unconscious feminine psyche that explains the sophisticated psychological dynamics Schopenhauer observed but couldn't fully decode. Jung's concept of the animus, the masculine aspect within every woman's psyche, provides the missing key to understanding female behavior that appears contradictory or mysterious to the external observer. The animus isn't simply an abstract concept. It's an active psychological force that unconsciously drives much of feminine behavior in relationships, career, and social dynamics. Here's where this becomes crucial for understanding feminine power. Jung discovered that women often unconsciously project their animus onto the men in their lives, creating complex dynamics where they're simultaneously seeking their own unexpressed masculine qualities in their partners while testing whether those qualities are authentic or performative. Consider the woman who says she wants a strong, decisive leader, but then challenges every decision her partner makes. From a Jungian perspective, she's not being contradictory. She's unconsciously engaging in animus integration. She's attracted to masculine decisiveness because it represents something she hasn't fully developed within herself, but she also needs to verify whether this external masculinity can withstand her own inner masculine energy. This dynamic explains what Schopenhauer observed but couldn't fully account for: why women often seem to create conflict even in relationships they value. It's not conscious manipulation. It's an unconscious process of psychological development where the woman is simultaneously drawn to certain masculine qualities and compelled to test their authenticity through challenge and resistance. The 4 stages of animus development. Jung identified 4 distinct stages of animus development in women, each creating different relationship dynamics and power expressions. Stage 1. The physical animus. At this level, women are unconsciously attracted to pure physical power and prowess. This manifests as attraction to athletes, warriors, or men who embody raw masculine energy. The power dynamic here is relatively straightforward. The woman gains reflected status and protection through association with physical dominance. Stage 2. The romantic animus. Here, women project their animus onto men who embody adventure, creativity, or romantic idealism. Think Byron, Kennedy, or the charismatic artist. The woman unconsciously seeks to experience her own creative and adventurous potential through her partner, often creating dramatic, passionate, but unstable relationships. Stage 3. The intellectual animus. At this stage, women are drawn to men who represent knowledge, wisdom, or intellectual authority: professors, doctors, spiritual teachers. The unconscious dynamic involves the woman seeking to develop her own intellectual and spiritual capacities through relationship with someone who embodies these qualities. Stage 4. The spiritual animus. The most developed form involves integration, where the woman has largely withdrawn her animus projections and developed her own masculine qualities. She can then relate to men as equals rather than as carriers of her own unconscious potential. Understanding these stages helps explain the seeming fickleness that Schopenhauer observed in feminine attraction. A woman isn't changing her mind arbitrarily. She's unconsciously following a developmental path that requires different types of masculine energy at different stages of psychological growth. The testing imperative. One of Jung's most important insights about feminine psychology was that women possess an unconscious testing imperative, an evolved psychological mechanism that compels them to continuously assess the authenticity and strength of the masculine energy around them. This isn't conscious scheming. It's as involuntary as breathing. The feminine psyche has developed sophisticated methods for determining whether the masculine qualities a man displays are genuine expressions of developed character or mere performances designed to gain access and approval. These tests typically take forms that appear irrational from a masculine perspective: emotional volatility that seems to come from nowhere, changing expectations without clear communication, creating situations that require the man to choose between his own needs and hers, or expressing interest in other men to gauge his security and response. From the woman's unconscious perspective, each of these behaviors serves a crucial function. Emotional volatility tests whether he can remain centered when her energy becomes chaotic. Changing expectations reveal whether he's following her lead out of genuine flexibility or weak compliance. Forced choices between his needs and hers show whether he has a solid sense of self or loses himself in the relationship. The feminine shadow and power. Jung's concept of the shadow, the repressed and disowned aspects of personality, manifests differently in feminine psychology than in masculine psychology. The feminine shadow often contains positive qualities that women have been socialized to suppress: aggression, ambition, direct sexuality, intellectual arrogance, and what Jung called spiritual ruthlessness. When these shadow qualities remain unconscious, They often emerge in indirect ways that can be extremely powerful precisely because they're not recognized as expressions of power. A woman who has suppressed her own aggression might become a master of passive-aggressive influence. One who has disowned her ambition might become exceptionally skilled at achieving goals through others. This creates what Schopenhauer observed as the invisible power of feminine influence. Because these shadow expressions don't look like traditional masculine power, they often operate beneath the conscious awareness of those being influenced. The woman herself might not recognize that she's wielding power, experiencing her actions as natural responses to circumstances rather than strategic choices. Emotional intelligence as feminine mastery. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of feminine psychology that both Schopenhauer and Jung recognized is what modern psychology calls emotional intelligence, the ability to read, understand, and influence emotional dynamics with remarkable precision. Women's brains, research now shows, are typically more developed in areas related to emotional processing, social cognition, and interpersonal attunement. This isn't cultural conditioning. It's neurobiology shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure where women's survival depended on their ability to navigate complex social relationships and accurately assess the emotional states of others. This emotional intelligence manifests in several key ways. Micro-expression reading. Women often unconsciously detect and respond to facial expressions, vocal tones, and body language cues that men miss entirely. This allows them to sense a partner's mood changes, truthfulness, or hidden motivations before these become consciously apparent. Emotional contagion. The feminine psyche is often highly skilled at creating and transmitting emotional states. When a woman shifts her emotional energy, others in her environment often unconsciously mirror that shift. This isn't manipulation. It's an evolved social skill that allows women to influence group dynamics through emotional leadership. Indirect communication. Women have developed sophisticated abilities to communicate complex information through subtext, implication, and emotional nuance. This allows them to convey needs, boundaries, and expectations without direct confrontation, often achieving better results than explicit demands. Intuitive synthesis. The feminine mind often excels at integrating multiple sources of information, emotional, social, physical, environmental, into rapid intuitive assessments. This women's intuition that Schopenhauer noted is actually a sophisticated information processing system that operates largely below conscious awareness. The neuroscience of feminine psychology. Modern neuroscience has begun to validate many of Jung's insights about feminine psychology while adding crucial new layers of understanding about how these psychological patterns are encoded in brain structure and function. The female brain and social cognition. Dr. Luann Brizendine's research on the female brain reveals significant differences in neural architecture that help explain the psychological patterns Jung observed. Women's brains typically show greater development in areas associated with language and communication. Women's brains show more bilateral language processing, meaning they use both hemispheres for communication tasks. This creates enhanced verbal abilities and greater skill at reading between the lines of what others say. Emotional processing. The female brain typically has a larger limbic system relative to overall brain size, creating more intense emotional experiences and greater emotional memory formation. This enhanced emotional processing contributes to the sophisticated emotional intelligence that characterizes feminine psychology. Social observation. Areas of the brain associated with observing and interpreting social behavior are typically more active in women. This creates the enhanced social awareness that allows women to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with remarkable skill. Stress response. Women's brains show different patterns of stress response, typically favoring tend and befriend strategies over fight or flight. This difference helps explain the collaborative and relationship-focused approaches that characterize much feminine behavior. Hormonal influences on psychology. The cyclical nature of female hormones creates psychological dynamics that have no direct equivalent in masculine experience. These hormonal fluctuations don't just affect mood. They influence cognition, social preferences, risk assessment, and relationship priorities in ways that create what appears to be inconsistency, but is actually sophisticated biological programming. During different phases of the menstrual cycle, women's preferences and partners, their risk tolerance, their social needs, and their emotional sensitivity all fluctuate in predictable patterns. Understanding these patterns helps explain some of the behaviors that Schopenhauer found puzzling. Women aren't being arbitrary, they're following complex biological rhythms that influence psychological experience. The oxytocin system and bonding. Women's brains typically produce and respond to oxytocin, the bonding hormone, differently than men's brains. This creates enhanced capacity for emotional bonding, but also different experiences of attachment and separation. The female oxytocin system creates what researchers call tend and befriend responses to stress, leading women to seek social connection and support during difficult times. This biological tendency helps explain the relationship-focused approaches that characterize much feminine psychology and the sophisticated social networks that women often create and maintain. Neuroplasticity and adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, research shows that women's brains demonstrate enhanced neuroplasticity, the ability to change and adapt neural pathways based on experience. This greater neuroplasticity contributes to the psychological flexibility that allows women to adapt to changing circumstances and navigate complex social environments. This enhanced adaptability helps explain the sophisticated strategic thinking that Schopenhauer observed in feminine behavior. Women aren't just following fixed scripts, they're continuously adapting their approaches based on feedback from their environment, creating highly sophisticated and context-sensitive behavioral patterns. The architecture of feminine influence. Building on both Jungian insights and modern neuroscience, we can begin to map what might be called the architecture of feminine influence, the sophisticated psychological mechanisms through which women unconsciously shape their social and relational environments. The emotional thermostat. One of the most powerful tools in the feminine psychological arsenal is what we might call emotional thermostating, the ability to regulate the emotional climate of relationships and social situations. This operates largely below conscious awareness, but creates profound influence over group dynamics and individual behavior. Women often unconsciously monitor the emotional temperature of their environment and make subtle adjustments to maintain optimal conditions for their goals. This might involve offering emotional support when someone is distressed, creating gentle tension when energy is too low, or providing celebration and validation when someone achieves success. This emotional regulation isn't manipulation in the conscious sense. It's an evolved psychological skill that allows women to create and maintain the social conditions necessary for survival and thriving. But it does represent a sophisticated form of environmental control that operates through emotional rather than physical or financial means. The information network. Another key aspect of feminine psychology is the creation and maintenance of sophisticated information networks. Women typically excel at gathering, processing, and sharing social information in ways that create significant strategic advantages. This information processing includes tracking relationship dynamics, social hierarchies, unspoken tensions, hidden motivations, and emerging opportunities within their social environment. Women often maintain detailed mental maps of who has influence, who has needs, who has resources, and how these various elements interact. This information mastery allows women to navigate social situations with remarkable precision, often achieving goals through strategic relationship building rather than direct confrontation or competition. The nurturing power structure. Perhaps most sophisticated is what we might call the nurturing power structure, the way women often build influence through appearing to serve others while actually shaping outcomes to align with their preferences. This isn't conscious deception. It's an evolved psychological pattern where women genuinely derive satisfaction from caring for others while unconsciously structuring that care in ways that create the outcomes they prefer. The person being nurtured experiences genuine care and support, while the woman gradually shapes the relationship dynamic to serve her deeper needs and goals. This pattern helps explain the phenomenon that puzzled Schopenhauer, how women often seem to gain power through apparent powerlessness. The authenticity test. One of the most consistent patterns in feminine psychology is what we might call authenticity testing, the unconscious drive to determine whether the people in their environment are genuine or performing roles to gain approval or access. These tests often take forms that seem irrational or unnecessary from a masculine perspective, creating minor conflicts to see how someone responds under pressure, making seemingly unreasonable requests to test commitment levels, or withdrawing affection to see if someone's interest remains consistent. From an evolutionary perspective, these behaviors make perfect sense. Women's reproductive investment has historically been enormous, making the ability to accurately assess potential partners' character, resources, and commitment absolutely crucial for survival. The sophistication of these tests lies in their ability to reveal authentic character rather than performed behavior. They're designed to bypass conscious impression management and reveal how someone actually responds when their self-interest conflicts with others' needs. The modern evolution of feminine psychology. The psychological patterns that Jung identified and modern neuroscience has validated are now evolving in response to contemporary social and technological changes. Understanding how ancient feminine psychology adapts to modern contexts reveals both new opportunities and new challenges. Career and ambition integration. One of the most significant developments in modern feminine psychology is the integration of traditionally masculine ambition and career focus with traditional feminine relationship and nurturing priorities. This integration creates new forms of feminine power that combine the best of both psychological traditions. Modern women often demonstrate what we might call integrated ambition, the ability to pursue professional and personal goals while maintaining the sophisticated emotional and relational skills that characterize feminine psychology. This creates women who are formidable in professional contexts while remaining sophisticated in relational ones. However, this integration also creates internal tensions as women navigate between psychological systems that evolved for different purposes. The result is often women who feel pulled between competing priorities and struggle to find sustainable ways to honor all aspects of their psychological nature. Technology and social networks. Social media and digital communication have created new arenas for the expression of traditional feminine psychological patterns. The information gathering, social network building, and influence creation that women have always excelled at now operates on unprecedented scales. Women often demonstrate remarkable skill at building and maintaining large social networks through digital platforms, creating influence and opportunities through relationship building rather than direct self-promotion. This represents an evolution of traditional feminine social intelligence adapted to modern technological tools. The authenticity challenge. Perhaps the most significant challenge facing modern feminine psychology is what we might call the authenticity challenge. How to maintain genuine emotional expression and relationship building in contexts that increasingly reward performance and strategic presentation. As women become more conscious of their own psychological patterns and more strategic in their approach to career and relationships, there's a risk of losing the unconscious authenticity that makes feminine influence most effective. The challenge is learning to be strategic without becoming manipulative, conscious without becoming calculating. The integration path forward. Understanding the sophisticated architecture of feminine psychology isn't meant to reduce women to biological programming or to suggest that these patterns are fixed and unchangeable. Instead, it's meant to provide a foundation for what we might call conscious femininity, the integration of evolved psychological patterns with modern consciousness and choice. Honoring natural patterns while choosing expression. The path forward involves honoring the sophisticated psychological patterns that evolution has created while consciously choosing how to express them in modern contexts. This means recognizing that emotional intelligence, social awareness, and relationship building are genuine strengths, while also developing the ability to express these strengths in ways that serve contemporary goals and values. Developing integrated power. Perhaps most importantly, understanding feminine psychology creates opportunities for women to develop what we might call integrated power, the combination of traditional feminine strengths with traditionally masculine capabilities in ways that create new forms of effectiveness and influence. This integration allows women to be simultaneously nurturing and ambitious, emotionally intelligent, and strategically sophisticated, relationship-focused, and individually powerful. Instead of choosing between these qualities, conscious femininity involves learning to express all of them in harmonious and effective ways, creating new models of leadership. Finally, this understanding creates opportunities for new models of leadership and influence that combine the best of feminine and masculine psychological approaches. Instead of women having to choose between traditional femininity and masculine-modeled success, they can create new paradigms that honor the sophisticated psychological patterns they've inherited while adapting them to serve contemporary purposes. The unconscious psychological patterns that Jung identified aren't limitations. They're sophisticated tools that can be consciously developed and skillfully applied. Understanding them is the first step toward using them with full awareness and intentional choice. The feminine psyche contains remarkable wisdom about relationship, influence, and social dynamics that the modern world desperately needs. The challenge is learning to access this wisdom consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by it, creating space for choice and growth while honoring the deep patterns that make feminine psychology so remarkably sophisticated and effective.